unless there is a return to monarchical rule. This will be the first millennium, in around 3,000 years, that an African ruler descended from King David doesn't sit on a throne. That's if you subscribe to the belief that His Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie's bloodline can be traced back to Menelik I, the offspring of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. If true, then that's a rich history in every way. Unfortunately, since Ethiopians got rid of the emperor in 1974, some of the subsequent rulers have been less than majestic. In the 50 years since the end of royal rule, an estimated 1.7 million Ethiopians have died of starvation, the very thing that caused the monarchy's overthrow.
The scenes were almost biblical in their intensity, the suffering almost unbearable. As one relief worker put it, the closest thing to hell on earth. When rumors of food arriving did get around, there was mass panic. Even though a rough and ready organization was introduced to distribute such aid as there was, it was reckoned that nearly 1 million people were dead or dying, and another 6 million were seriously under threat.
And with regional war once again on its foreseeable horizon, this could take the death count, since the 70s, into a genocidal range should the accompanying threats of war be acted on. What a humiliating prospect for a country that almost completely avoided the massacres of colonialism. Especially because most of these deaths have been a result of civil strife or agricultural mismanagement and not combat with other nations. After all, it's not like they've forgotten their equally admired and envied history. A case in point: Ethiopian Airlines. This is the best example of the pioneering stuff that made Ethiopia one of Africa's greatest ancient civilizations. Landlocked Ethiopia has managed to become the main gateway to Africa when it comes to air travel. And they've done this without being one of the top tourist destinations on the continent. A testament to what the country could achieve if other neglected areas of Ethiopian society also emulated the results of their airspace authorities. More than any other country in Africa, Ethiopia puts a puzzle to those who believe that colonialism was needed to modernize Africa. Now that deserves a medal. However, the Western colonial powers did beat them to get rid of one backward practice, which Ethiopians continued with well into the 20th century: slavery. It should be noted, though, that while the country escaped colonialism, not all its citizens were free, as slavery was only stopped in the 1940s and 50s.
At the League of Nations, a grave disturbance. Today, Haile Selassie comes to plead for his lost empire. He wants them to make Mussolini give up Ethiopia. The British Foreign Minister Eden, Soviet Delegate Litvinov on the left, and French Premier Blum and all the statesmen, instead of helping Haile Selassie, have decided to lift the sanctions against Italy.
Ethiopia's international diplomacy in the late 19th century up to the mid-20th century is something to be admired for the ages. She stood alone as her neighbors were falling one by one to Europe's invasion of the continent. Eritrea, 1882. Djibouti, 1883. British Somaliland, 1884. Kenya, 1895. Italian Somaliland, 1889. Sudan, 1899. As you can see, Ethiopia was totally enveloped by Europe then. Now, without the details, it's easy to imagine that Ethiopia took a policy of appeasement to avoid colonization, or that they didn't really stand alone against colonialism, akin to how some in Britain claim to have stood alone against Germany in World War II, when in reality Russia was also fighting in Eastern Europe and the industrial might of America was still supporting them logistically. Not so here. For early 20th, but especially late 19th century Ethiopia, they were pretty much on their own. Nobody was coming to help them out of their predicament. Ethiopia really stood alone against the colonial might of Europe. But they weren't ignorant of their standing. If colonization did indeed happen, it wasn't going to be a shock for them. Ethiopia's rulers were well aware of Europe's technological superiority and had long been acquainted with modern Europe's affairs. Let me explain. Among many issues that divides Ethiopians is religion. Because some of the government symbols and historical rulers have been Christian, many people think that Ethiopia is a Christian country, but there's a sizable Muslim community. And of course, the country has had conflicts centered around the two religions. None more so than the Ethiopian Adal War. From 1529 to 1543, the Christian Ethiopians were at war with the Muslim Ethiopians who were supported by Turks and Arabs. Ethiopia's emperor then was Margeladus. Back then, Christian Ethiopia, which had been cut off from its roots with the collapse of the Roman Empire, was in a dire situation. The spread of Islam had overwhelmed the region, and had it not been for the intervention of Portuguese gunpowder by the men under Christopher da Gama, the son of the famous Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, then Christian Ethiopia may have been a lot less than the 80 million strong they are today. Because of this, 19th and 20th century Ethiopia was way ahead of contemporaries in weaponry and diplomacy. But they were still behind Europe. So in 1868 you'd expect the first battle to be provoked by the Europeans. Right? Nope. The emperor this time was Tewodros II. And the root issues were similar to those of Emperor Geladus, as Ethiopia's Islamic rivals, the Turks and Egyptians, had invaded once again. The emperor was also in the midst of an internal revolt as some members of the nobility were resisting his rule. Perhaps he imagined that the solution to his problems lay once again with European intervention. Hoping to get the rescue package that his predecessor got from the Portuguese earlier, the emperor decided to appeal to Britain, France, Russia, and Austria for assistance. Unfortunately, the evangelical phase of the Portuguese against Islam had served its usefulness, and the Europeans now required more complex reasons to intervene. With the exception of France, he was ignored by the lot. Running out of options, a furious Emperor Tewodros retaliated on the nearest Europeans he could find, the diplomats and missionaries. This resulted in the Battle of Magdala, where the emperor ended up committing suicide after the British defeated his army. After this loss, a humbled Ethiopia was convinced that a more conciliatory policy was needed towards the British. They even assisted them in their campaign against the Sudanese during the Mahdist Wars between 1881 and 1899. Hostilities against their traditional enemies in the Muslim world continued, though. From 1874 to 1876, they fought Ottoman-ruled Egypt and were victorious. Now, up until 1895, Ethiopia had been cunning and resourceful enough to position itself as the predator rather than the prey in regional conflicts, largely by supporting the British. But this approach was only going to work so long as Britain's interests were involved in any disputes. Look, it's inevitable that after a certain point every nation's interest becomes uniquely their own. So its institutions must be able to withstand those of its adversaries economically and militarily. Surrounded by European and Muslim aggression, Ethiopia couldn't maintain her sovereignty without conflict of some sort. So when Italy decided to enter into a treaty with the Ethiopians in 1889, there seems to have been words that were lost in translation. The Ethiopians were of the understanding that it was an agreement whereby they had the option, but were not obliged to conduct its foreign affairs through the Italians. However, the Italians felt otherwise. They believed that the treaty compelled the Ethiopians to work through the Italians' diplomats on foreign matters, effectively taking Ethiopia's sovereignty as its own. Emperor Menelik, who was ruler of Ethiopia at the time, made appeals to other European countries for help but was met with the same unwillingness that Emperor Geladus encountered. However, Emperor Menelik had expected such an eventuality and had discreetly bought modern weaponry from Europe in preparation for a future war. That war would be the one against the Italians. Starting with skirmishes that eventually escalated into battles, the war between the Italians and the Ethiopians lasted from 1895 to 1896. This time, Ethiopia won the war and secured a peace that would only be challenged again in the build-up to World War II, making Emperor Menelik the founder of modern Ethiopia. Now, after Emperor Menelik died in 1913, Ethiopia went through a period of modernization, showing the world that an African country could be governed into modern times through willful emulation rather than forced submission. Italy would have another go at Ethiopia in the 1930s under the fascist Benito Mussolini. By now, Ethiopia was firmly represented on the world stage and expected world organizations such as the League of Nations to at least offer assistance by way of sanctions on the Italians. In a forerunner case of impotence, the League of Nations proved to be powerless in demonstrating and preserving justice for its member state Ethiopia. Furthermore, the European diplomatic circuit once again showed its traditional indifference to another European nation's attack on Ethiopia. Japan followed suit, declaring its uninterest in Ethiopia's affairs. Shockingly, it was Hitler's Germany that provided the isolated Ethiopians with assistance in their fight against the Italians. This is one of the most ignored periods in European and African history. It wasn't enough to change the expected outcome, and the Italians were swift to avenge the humiliation their forefathers suffered in 1896 against Emperor Menelik. Only once Italy's aggression became a shared experience with other European countries did Ethiopia begin to see a favorable moderation and sympathy to their plight. They were finally an ally with the Allies. To their credit, the British sheltered the emperor while he was forced into exile, marched on the Italians in Ethiopia, took back Addis Ababa, administered the country until the end of World War II, and eventually returned full governance back to Emperor Haile Selassie. And after Mussolini's troops left the city in World War II, Addis Ababa lost a lot of its utopian appeal as many African cities also became independent of colonial rule and began to enjoy similar liberties. Today, Addis Ababa is at a crossroads. A fast-growing population and economy can see it return to the apex of African society in contrast to its recent decades of underperformance. With the African Union choosing Addis Ababa as the site for its headquarters, the city was granted center stage in global politics for the foreseeable future, extending Ethiopia's long history of African government by African people. In doing so, Ethiopia's future and current leaders are going to have to cover a lot of ground if they are to consider themselves equals to Emperor Menelik and Emperor Haile Selassie in international relations. Whether it's the damming of the Nile waters, recent state relations with Somaliland, or escalating tribal divisions, there's trouble brewing. It's chaos and opportunity all at once. Like a teenager's physical explosion, these events may be the awakening of a sleeping giant flexing its powers once again, or the symptoms of an ancient society that is seceding, as deep-rooted bonds begin to wear thin from longing. But so far so good, as no immediate foreign threats to the city have materialized. Despite this uncertainty, Addis Ababa is developing fast. Though it doesn't have the ancient mystique that the country as a whole has, due to its delayed arrival in Ethiopia's history. From its foundations in the 1880s as the grounds selected for Empress Tete new house, and eventually as the palace of her husband Emperor Menelik, it is now increasingly becoming Africa's air transport and political hub. Strangely, Addis Ababa remains a relatively small city for a country with a huge population like Ethiopia. Just 4 million people from a total population of 130 million stay in Addis Ababa. This shows that there is a lot of risk for sudden urban migration into the city. So city planners beware. This could be another case of chaos and opportunity. A return to glory of some sorts if managed properly. Perhaps the wisdom of Solomon will also prove to be hereditary in a democracy.